What made you call CPS? Viewers Edition. Oh boy, before we even get into talking about these things, I'm already wondering why it's such a seemingly common occurrence that CPS needs to be called in the first place, that there were so many stories available. To me, that just says a lot about the resources, or lack thereof, that are available in this country for kids and parents. And yeah, I say this country because, as far as I know, CPS is specific to the US. I know there's probably similar services and agencies in other countries, but I do wonder if a country that puts more emphasis on the value of the community and families, say, for instance, any of those Scandinavian countries that always rank as happiest in the world, would be dealing with the same percentage of cases like these. Anyway, let's hear what you all had to say on this. Story 1. I had a cousin with 7 children ranging in ages from 4 to 17. When I'd stop in to visit her, I'd have to walk through this small pathway between mountains of clothes and other junk. There were rooms in this house that she was renting, and you couldn't even get into any more because it was full of junk. For some reason, she decided to keep them, like piles of old clothes her kids would never wear. The kitchen looked as if it was never cleaned in the 2 years that they lived there. Later, I had to use the restroom. When I first walked into the bathroom, I stood there shocked at what I was seeing. In front of me sat the commode with human defecation standing a good foot above the rim of the commode. I was just horrified, especially since she had small children in her house again. I need to explain something here. When her older children were little, ages 3 to 7, I used to do babysitting for her. She didn't even have the other children yet. So the next day I called and reported her to the state's hotline for reporting childhood abuse. Not just once either. I had waited for a few months, and nothing was done. So I called them again, this time questioning them as to why they haven't done anything about the condition her very young children have had to live in. Her house was never this bad when I used to babysit for her. Yet again, months after I reported the situation, nothing happened. Before the state even decided to do a home visit, their old landlord discovered how they were living and how bad the house was. He was even being kind to her, renting the place to her for as cheap as he did. He did it for a few reasons. 1, because he knew all our parents since they were children. He knew us kids growing up. And then 3, he was trying to make sure the little ones had a place to sleep. I've known her landlord as long as I can remember. He's always treated me kindly, spending time to talk to me, even though he had a lot of customers wanting on him at the time. Anyway, he had to make them move because of the condition of the house. I had lost contact with my cousin and her children. I didn't know where they'd moved to. The house was left in such bad shape from her and the kids living there that it was actually condemned by the town. Being the sly old business guy he was, he had seen this as a way to turn it to his advantage. He ended up building an apartment where the old house stood on a big corner lot in the town. Years later, I heard through the family grapevine that she had passed away from kidney failure. Story 2. My mother literally gave me 3 broken ribs for asking for a glass of water on a hot day at age 4. By the time I started school at 5, my father had been using the belt buckle on my legs and caused bleeding from the belt latch hitting my shins and penetrating. I was forced to only wear shorts and a t-shirt so everyone could see the obvious abuse and see what a naughty boy I was. Not a single person ever called anyone to help me. I was regularly beaten by both my parents that were, and still are, violent alcoholics. Mother spent many moments trying to end my life with choking me with her hands while telling me I was a mistake that stuffed up her life. I was the oldest of 3 boys, and therefore all arguments that my brothers had were my fault. This continued even when I was in college and would get home hours after my brothers had been arguing. I'd get home around 6:30, then suddenly I'd cop the belt buckle, whilst being told that the other 2 had been arguing and I'm being punished because it's my fault. I was 16 at that point. At age 14, I had enough and warned my father that I would punch him if he didn't stop. He kept going, so I broke his jaw. That same year, 1983, I had to punch my mother in the face to get her hands off my throat. Last time my mother had her hands around my throat was in the Xmas break in 2009. 2010, I quit any association with any family members and disappeared. Police know why. Due to long-standing family problems, we all had psych evaluations, and the only normal one in the family is my youngest brother. Next brother and my father are narcissists. Meanwhile, my mother is a bipolar psychopath. 3 years ago, at age 51, I was diagnosed as high-functioning autistic. Now I'm 54 and finally had 13 years of peace. Against popular opinion, not all high-functioning autistics are incapable of living independently. In fact, I've had others live with me because they needed help. So this misconception about us needs to stop being a common belief, because it's frequently used to be dismissive of those who don't fit nor follow the whims of society. I'm still the person that people bring various equipment to, so it can be fixed. Most of us technicians have autistic traits, but still considered to be less than normal. By the way, I still have the scars on my shins from the abuse. Story 3. I had to be with this kid in kindergarten. I think his name was Aiden. So, from my memory, Aiden used to be very physically abusive. All he did to me was run at me, knock me down, and then lay on top of me and sit and growl and yell in my face. I always used to be terrified at school, thinking that he would be right around the corner at all times, ready to freaking pounce on me. It didn't help that the teacher didn't do jack poop about anything. I'd go crying and begging to her that I was scared and I wanted to go home. And all I remember her doing is giving me some piece of cardboard and saying that if I ever felt scared, I could put this piece of cardboard in front of my face and say that this is my protective sign that I wanted to be left alone. And that's it. That's not even the worst of it. Honestly, I got off pretty easy. I don't remember any of this from my perspective, but from what I've been told, Aiden used to take pencils and stab other kids with them. And he was apparently caught saying something around the lines of, "Do whatever the other kid was doing again, and I'll stab you in the eye with this pencil." Again, this was in freaking kindergarten, and the teacher couldn't care less. We got moved to another class, obviously, and I was still scared of him coming back for me. And no one at that poop show of a school managed to help me with my fear. I do feel bad for him in a way because I'm sure he had a bad life back at home or was a mental hiccup that was never cared about in the school. I hate the kid for ruining my early childhood, but I also feel bad for him in a way. And I've never seen him since. Yeah, let's just have this kid who's being pummeled on by a bully just hold a flimsy piece of cardboard in front of his face so he can't anticipate the next attack. This has got to be one of the dumbest ways to deal with the situation. Visually, it even resembles the classic, karate sparring practice move of breaking a board of wood held out in front of your face, so it's almost just egging on the kid further. Story 4. When I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, my teachers physically abused me, locked me in a room, and told me if I didn't behave, they would starve me to death. It still shocks me to my very core that teachers are supposed to be mandated reporters for students who are abused at home. How could I trust my teachers to report abuse to those who could help when they're the ones abusing me? These teachers were required to report everything we did for the day to our parents because it was a behavioral class, and oftentimes they would simply lie on the report to make me look violent and them look like heroes. I was the weird kid who looked over lesson plans and teachers' papers, and I found out in 3rd grade that the more violent kids got less lies. My main problem was that I was too sassy and would sometimes try to escape from class when it wasn't time to go home, but some of the other students were in there for swearing, hitting, and other generally violent things. With that being said, there was one situation involving another kid that sticks out in my memory. He was 2 grades behind me, in 1st grade at the time, and he badmouthed a teacher. She put in on the report, and he started crying, begging her not to, saying that for every point taken off the maximum 255-point system, his mom put 1 pump of hot sauce in his mouth as a punishment. This was probably a reportable offense, but I'll never know because, in response, the teacher said in that condescending teacher voice, "You should have thought about that before you swore at me," then proceeded to take off points for each time he begged until he accepted defeat. I'm pretty sure he got down to 245 before he surrendered. So once again, I proclaim, how could one trust a teacher to report at-home abuse when she's the one abusing children in her care? Story 5. Different type of story, but when I was younger, around 0 through 12, my parents would always yell at each other violently over the littlest of things. One time afterwards, my mom threatened to drive her off a cliff, then actually got in her car and left after my dad called her bluff. I was around 8 or so as you could probably guess, I was terrified. She came back. Also, she would always yell at me over stupid stuff, too, and sometimes spank me. Multiple times, she threatened to beat me black and blue, her exact words. And my dad actually recently told me a story. One time, my mom arrived at home, no clue where she had been, and she looked like she was on drugs. She has had a drug problem for years now, and she dragged me out of my room by the arm. My dad blocked her from leaving with me by standing in the hallway, never once hurting her, aside from when she hurt herself by trying to push him, and she eventually called the cops and said that my dad had been beating her. My dad explained to them what was actually happening, and they calmed down the situation, then left. Never once was CPS involved, even though I have multiple trauma disorders from all that stuff that woman put me through. Thankfully, my parents got divorced when I was 12. Now she's living in a tiny camper in her mom's driveway, being a freaking druggie, always asking why I never want to visit her. Story 6. I wanted to call CPS on an ex-friend of mine. Backstory is, she used to do hard drugs right up until she found out she was pregnant. After she found out, she suddenly stopped. I have a hard time believing she did, but I never said anything. The baby came and he was more or less healthy, but as he got older, we noticed he has difficulty walking, and at age 1, still hasn't said a word. I know she still smoked weed in the house, dabs, but she said it just vaporizes, so it didn't affect him. Sure. I've also had to take the open canister of the wax out of his mouth before, and she just laughed and didn't see the danger of it. It honestly made me mad. Anyway, I brought up my concerns, and she said it makes her a more patient mom and will not listen to reason. My dad was going to make the call to CPS, but then passed away after a long battle with cancer. At the funeral, she and her other friends were very rude to me and my partner, and I cut it off with all of them after the funeral, telling them to never talk to me again. I know weed is the least dangerous drug out there, but I also know from hours of research that, on a baby's brain, it can cause delayed development. I don't have her number or address anymore because I cut them off, but I feel like I should tell somebody. What should I do? I'd say if you have legitimate reason to be concerned, then I don't see the harm in at least calling to report what you know. Then you've at least done your part and can leave it to the professionals to take over and follow through if it's warranted. Even if you don't have the address or contact info, a name or any history you might know of them should be enough for a government agency like CPS to locate up-to-date records and begin an investigation. If nothing else, it'll put your mind at ease that you've done what you could for the kid. Story 7. I was a playground attendant at this one school, and there were these two brothers, well, adoptive brothers. In reality, they happened to be second cousins, who were 9 and 6, and lived with the 6-year-old's grandfather. 6-year-old's mother couldn't care for him anymore, and 9-year-old's mother passed away while giving birth to him. 9-year-old would pick fights with anyone, and God forbid you antagonize his little brother, even though they would get into squabbles sometimes where the 6-year-old would get hurt. 6-year-old was very hyper and extroverted, but also a little scared sometimes. Well, one day I asked the 6-year-old what he wanted to be when he grows up, and he said, I don't know, but Gramps really wants us to be police like him, and yells and hits us when we don't wanna. I then went to the 9-year-old and told him about what his brother had said, and he said that the day before, he had gotten into an argument with the 6-year-old's grandfather and said that police are dumb, which caused Gramps to lose his mind and beat the absolute crap out of the 9-year-old. I filed a CPS report, and the two were adopted out by one lady pretty quickly. Story 8. I had a really bad fight with another kid at school. We argued a lot, we both had wicked tempers, and I can't remember what led up to it. But at one point, he just snapped, grabbed my hair, slammed my head against the locker doorway, and began slamming my head with the locker door. Eventually, we broke apart, both dazed and pale as ghosts. This kid wasn't fluent in English, but he knew enough to ask me, "You have a bad home too?" My gut sank. I had heard rumors that his parents abused him, but I never paid any mind to rumors until that moment. I asked why, and he said he could see it in my eyes. We don't tell anyone, no parents involved, and we just agreed and walked away. We did argue a couple more times, but they weren't as fierce. People even thought I had a crush on him. I didn't. Story 9. I'm autistic, and I have one story where CPS was called. I was at school in the auditorium because of a large meeting that everyone had to attend to. I have really bad cases of meltdowns when too much noise or too loud noises are present near me because of auditory sensory overload, so I had a hired senior with me at the time to make sure I didn't have a meltdown in public. He didn't care for me. He had his AirPods on 24/7 and ignored me when I was literally on the floor crying with my hands over my ears to block out all the noise. A teacher called the cops on him after they realized that not only was he terrible at his job, but he also pushed me 4 times onto oncoming traffic, trying to get my life ended. I never went back to school. Story 10. Sadly, the CPS are just a joke in 90% of the cases. I knew well over 11 to 12 people in my class alone. It's a really small town, by the way, at most 20 students in a class, that dealt with extreme abuse. And of those people, all of them had called the police or CPS 1 or more times, and none of them got the help they needed. Seriously, a lot of the times it is genuinely worse to call them, as it just makes the parent angrier, as half the time they either don't want to deal with it or say something stupid like telling the kids it's not abuse to be beaten and burned by their parents. Story 11. What's worse is that CPS worker encouraged and condoned the abuse by giving the full report to your abusers for them to use as an excuse to hurt you more. A tip for any CPS workers that are actually trying to do their actual job: never, ever, ever, ever give the abuse victim's report to the abuser without quadruple checking on the children, preferably at random and without warning. That is the only way you will catch any abuser in the act. Find out when testing days are at the school and when they usually return the tests. Show up the day of or day after the return of the tests. That's when you're most likely to get your proof. Story 12. As someone who lived in foster care, I still get angry off those stories of CPS doing frick all to save the kids, but at the same time, I'm not surprised. I'm hoping after the years I've left care that they've changed. Was in from 2000 to 2008. Always makes you wonder if they gave a care or just did it for the publicity. Their propensity to put kids in horrible homes and ignore our complaints, writing it off as they're just being rebellious. Don't get me wrong, there's good homes, but from my experience, there's more crap ones than good. Story 13. It took CPS 5 years to take my multiple reports about the welfare of my nieces seriously. An investigation was launched. Many social workers were fired because of improper case handling. Turns out they'd been ignoring reports for the last 15 years, which included the reports my own school put in back when I was a kid. Had the reports been investigated back then, my mother would never have been given custody of my nieces in the first place. Basically, nothing was properly investigated within the county from the early 2000s to 2021. It really sucks that it seems to take such a long time to get a legitimate response from these agencies that are meant to ensure the safety of children. Hearing these, it really seems like they require an established long-term pattern of abuse before they can actually intervene and protect the kid. And if that's the case, then as crummy as it is, it might fall into the camp of best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, second best time is today. The sooner that you begin the process of reporting, the longer runtime there is for it to be established as legitimate and be taken seriously. Story 14. CPS was called on my mom several times for different reasons. First time I know of was when she was kicking my sister in the head and loudly yelling at her when she was 2. Poor neighbor had to witness it, and sadly it wasn't the only thing my mom had done to her, as that's one of the better things she did to her, and it wasn't just her that went through it, because of her. Trust me, I could go on with a massive list of things she has done and why she's in prison now. Story 15. This kid was making a joke next with some random high schoolers, and the teacher overheard him saying, "I would come with you, but if I get caught, my dad will whip me." And the teacher said, "That's not a very good thing to do. I have to call CPS." And he said it was just a joke, but she said that's not very funny. Nobody is laughing. But little did she know, all of us know how to hold in laughs. So while she goes far away, we all stopped holding it in, and one kid was literally crying. Story 16. I called CPS once on a neighbor after she consistently began leaving her newborn child on my doorstep. She assumed that because I was training to be a teacher, that I would be super happy to have a child dropped on my door. My husband worked in a clinic during flu season, and the child was less than 10 weeks old. Somehow her child wasn't taken away, and they had at least one other. She also bragged how she would never put her kids in school, that the Bible is the only thing they needed to know. That last sentence explains it all. If this person is one of them God-fearing Christians who follows the book of the Bible to the T, then it makes sense that they don't hesitate to leave their infant outside on a doorstep unattended, where any number of dangerous outcomes are possible. After all, wasn't it a guy from the Bible, Abraham or something, who offered his own son as a sacrifice to God to prove that he was loyal or something? Babies are really fragile, as it seems, and leaving them alone on the ground outside is a recipe for disaster. And of all that could go wrong, for some reason I can't shake the image of a hawk swooping down and snatching it up or something. Protect your dang babies, people, unless you want as violent of a tale as the Bible story. Story 17. Honestly, with my own experiences of social services in the UK, parents that are struggling and just need help have their kids taken away from them, and parents that are really abusing their kids get to keep them. This is often because those kids are scared of what will happen, so they deny that anything bad is happening, or often their parents know exactly what to say to the social worker to get them to leave them alone. Story 18. I was tearing up with some of these. I've never been abused as far as I know, but that ignorance on the subject doesn't make it easier to hear any of these stories. We all wonder why mental health continues to be such a problem in this world, and then we hear tragic stories like these that make us sick to our stomach, and we realize it's no wonder. Story 19. When I was in kindergarten, there were 2 kids in my class, brother and sister. One day at recess, the boy accidentally stepped in a ground hornet nest and was stung a lot. When they took him to the nurse, they found many bruises on the boy. I think it was only maybe a few months later, they were both adopted and stayed in our school. Story 20. What a vile and vicious world we live in. Even if we do get CPS involved, the CPS would still send us back or neglect us kids, only for us to either meet our demise at an early age or grow up to be monsters ourselves. Nobody wins. Us children will always lose in the end, no matter what we do. Story 21. If you're going to call CPS, collect as much proof as possible. Audio, video, texts, everything. The ones who care have very strict rules, and the ones who don't care have no oversight. You need hard evidence to prove this stuff, and CPS needs to see it to justify acting. Please, it matters so much. So much. Story 22. The good news is that if these or any other parents get caught for doing stuff like this and get thrown in the slammer, their fellow jail person mate gives them the special treatment for the scum who abuse kids on any level, basically doing what the parents did with their kids to straighten them out. Story 23. I got stupid lucky when it came to CPS giving a crap about the child abuse I went through. It makes me angry to hear so many stories of CPS not giving a crap about most abuse cases when their entire job is meant to protect kids from abuse. Story 24. Why would CPS tell alleged abusive parents what the child said and believe the lies? That's like telling a child molester where the nearest preschool is. Please leave your stories in the comments. I'd love to make a video of them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.